Over the last few weeks, we've been following the Road to Easter series. So we've heard that the disciples have stated Jesus is the Messiah, but they don't understand what this means for themselves or for him. We've heard there was a cost to discipleship, and that Jesus extended the invitation to be his disciples to everyone. And a couple of weeks ago, we heard about the transfiguration up the mountain, and that the disciples and Jesus had an affirmation of the journey they were on while they were there. So that's where we are up to at this point. Today, the journey to Jerusalem has moved on another step. And we're looking at this in Mark chapter 10, verses 32 to 45. So the disciples are once again told by Jesus that he is going to die, and they are asking what they can gain from him. But Jesus told them to serve and to put others first. So I'm going to start reading just a few verses before this passage starts, where Peter speaks to Jesus about what they've given up to follow him. So Mark 10, starting at verse 28. Peter began to say to him, "Look, we have left everything and followed you." Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for my sake and for the sake of the good news, who will not receive 100-fold now in this age, houses, brothers, sisters, mothers and children and fields with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first." They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was to happen, saying, "Look, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Jesus said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Appoint us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Jesus, sorry, I've read that. I lost my place. "But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to appoint, but it is for those whom it has been prepared." So when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. Instead, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." I have a very dry mouth. So Jesus and his disciples are on the way to Jerusalem. Jesus is still leading the way, and the disciples are still following him. Jesus is heading towards his suffering and his death. And he reminds the disciples of this. I'm not sure if the slides are moving on, Ali. Or did I not write something in the right place? Okay. Sorry, so Jesus is still leading the way and the disciples are still following. Jesus is heading towards his suffering and death, and he reminds the disciples of this. This is now the 3rd time that he has told them this, and he gives them more details about what will happen. So he tells them, He'll be betrayed and mocked and spit on and eventually put to death. But the disciples still don't fully understand this because they can't see the whole picture. They think they know what Jesus will do as the Messiah, but it's not what they think. Mark puts James and John's request in Mark directly after this statement when Jesus tells them he's going to die. When I was looking at this passage, the questions I was thinking about was, so what were the disciples asking for? So what was the implications? And secondly, why were they asking? So what was their motivation? So that's what I was looking at in the first part. In the second part of the passage, we see what Jesus' response to them was, and to us also, because we are his disciples. So what were they asking for? So in verse 28, Peter declares to Jesus that he and the other disciple have left everything to follow him. The question comes after Jesus tells a rich man he will have treasure in heaven if he sells everything he has and follows him. Peter hears the conversation and he asks Jesus what rewards they will have. He says, "We have left everything to follow you." In verses 35 and to 37, it's James and John who are now asking for special treatment. They come to Jesus and they ask if he will do something for them. They say, "We want to sit at your right hand and at your left." In the parallel account in Matthew's Gospel, it's James and John's mother who comes and kneels at Jesus' feet. She is the one who asked the question. But Jesus' response is to James and John. It's them who want this. They are the ones who are asking for it. It's thought that James and John are Jesus' cousins because their mother was the sister of Jesus. They were also two of his closest disciples. James, John, and Peter are the three who Jesus took up the mountain with him for the transfiguration. They were in his closest inner circle. What they were asking for might seem odd, but in Matthew 19, Jesus had told the disciples they would sit on thrones. He said, "Truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man is seated on his throne in glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So they had been told they were going to sit on thrones, but now they're asking for the best seats. In their society, to be seated at the right or left is about status. Those who are seated in those positions are the most important. They are the ones with the honor. So they are Jesus' closest companions and disciples, and they're asking what rewards or positions they can have. Although Mark has portrayed these three in this way, Jesus didn't hold it against them. They still remained in his closest circle even after these conversations. So when Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane, it's still those three he took with him away from the others. They were still there. They were still in his closest circle. In verse 38, Jesus uses the cup and the the cup and the baptism metaphors for his own suffering and death, and he asked James and John if they are able to suffer in the same way. But Jesus told them they didn't know what they were asking. He said, "Are you able to drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" And they said, "We are able." They believed they could do this. But they didn't know what they were asking for, and they didn't know what it meant. And sometimes we probably don't either. We may not know what we are asking God for or what the long-term implications are. We can be reassured if we ask God for something that is not good for us, he will say no. We may not see it at the time, and we may never see it. But God does not withhold things from us that are for our good. Even the commands are for our good. When we're told not to covet, it's not because God is trying to withhold something good from us. It's because if we want something we can't have, we will be miserable. So in Matthew 7, Jesus tells us that our Father wants to give good things to those who ask him. And if we ask for good gifts, he says he won't give something bad in its place. He wants what is for our good. If we ask for something bad, he'll say no. If we ask for something good, he won't give us something bad. So when Peter asked what they would get, Jesus told him that anyone who had left everything to follow him would receive 100-fold in this life, with persecutions and eternal life in the next. He told James and John they would suffer and that he couldn't grant their request. They were asking for rewards and positions, but they didn't know what they were asking for. But God only wants what is for our best. So when Dave gave me the title for today of Jockeying for Position, I Googled the word to see what it meant. Apparently, it just means competing against others for a desirable role or thing. The disciples are portrayed as competitive. Even after Jesus had died and rose again, they were still competing with each other. So in John's Gospel, John writes that Peter and the other disciple who Jesus loved raced to get to the tomb, and John is quick to point out it was the other disciple who got there first, and John is thought to be that disciple. They were competitive, but it doesn't just stop with them. The wider circle of disciples was competitive too. So in verse 41, the other disciples get angry when they hear what James and John have asked. We don't know if this is because they were jealous because they didn't think of it first, or whether they were angry and shocked that they would ask such a question. But this was not the first time that positions had been discussed amongst the disciples. So in Mark 9, they had been arguing about who was the greatest among them. Mark had put that discussion after Jesus told them the second time that he was going to die. It's a recurring theme in Mark. Jesus says to the disciples he's going to die, and the disciples want to know who is the most important. We are not told what James and John's motivation is directly. It has been suggested they could be trying to lead Jesus away from thinking about his death, as Peter did the first time when they were told. But Peter got reprimanded for that by Jesus, and John and James don't in this passage, not in the same way. It could be they were not listening to what Jesus was saying or not understanding what he was telling them, which is not an uncommon theme then or now. Sometimes we don't understand and sometimes we don't listen. Based on how Jesus responds to them and on their previous behaviour, it does seem likely that they were seeking the most important positions in the group. They want to have the seats of power and authority, and they want to rule over others in the new kingdom. But the other disciples are not so different. Some time ago, I heard a sermon about Judas Iscariot. At the end of the talk, the minister told us all to go and look in the mirror. He was saying there is a little bit of Judas in all of us. I think there is probably a bit of Peter, James, John, Judas, and all of the disciples in all of us. Jesus' response at the end of the passage is addressed to all of the disciples, not just James and John. He calls them over and he reminds them how living in his kingdom works. He tells them how they are to treat other people. He says, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But not so among you." In the Gentile context at that time, they were facing difficulties and hardship. It was seen as a sign of ambition if you were seeking those positions. But this is not how Jesus told them to be, and this is what he said to them. It must have eventually sunk in, because in Peter's first letter, he tells those he is writing to not to lord it over other people. At the end of the passage, Jesus reminds the disciples he has come to serve, to give up his life for the world. He led by example. He tells them they are to serve and to put others first. In 43 and 44, he tells them, whoever wants to become great must be servants amongst each other and slaves of all. The slave was considered in a lower position than the servant. He says you are to serve the other disciples and be slaves of everyone. He widens it out to all people. Jesus is not talking about their motivation. We don't serve other people to become the most important. He is saying this is the way to live in his kingdom. This is what he did, and this is what he teaches us to do. But the disciples haven't figured it out yet. Jesus is the one with the authority, and they are all equal with each other. Their relationships that they have with each other need to be transformed, but only Jesus can do that. The passage ends with Jesus telling them he came to give his life a ransom for many. Jesus has told them how he is going to die, and now he tells them why. He came to serve those he created, to give his life for them, and he did that to make it possible for us to have eternal life if we believe in him and if we follow him. In the commentary on Mark I was using, the author wrote that the greatest work ever done was accomplished by the one who gave his life for other people. He says, self-giving service is the only greatness recognized by God, and that those who do that are, he wrote, willing to let life go hang for the sake of another. I think he means putting other people first before ourselves. And sometimes that might mean stepping to one side so that someone else can do something we want to do or have something that we want to have. Or possibly it could be putting what is best for the whole group above our own individual interests. You probably have your own ideas on this. Dave was talking about it last week in the service. So I'm going to finish with the words from a modern version of an old hymn, which I found helpful when I was looking at this. It says, "Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Turn your eyes to the hillside, where justice and mercy embraced. There the Son of God gave his life for us, and our measureless debt was erased. Turn your eyes to the heavens, our King will return for his own. Every knee will bow, and every tongue will shout, all glory to Jesus alone." And I'm going to hand back to Dave.
Thanks, Joe. Thank